man, a woman does not inspire me by telling me to push myself harder. You know what I mean? She doesn't inspire me by telling me that I need to be more ambitious. She don't inspire me by doing anything like that. You know what I mean? How does a woman inspire me as a man? You know what I mean? A woman inspires me as me being a man by trying to better herself. You know what I mean? Like, for instance, the way I take it, because this is the way it usually goes in my life or whatever, I've been inspired. I'm inspired when a woman wants to be more or wants more for herself. It's sort of like, as a husband, you have a wife, who wants to do certain things, whatever. You may not have the finances to do it, but she keeps showing this interest, that this is what she wants, and so she tries her best to do it, and she keeps bringing it to your attention, like, I like to do this, but we can't do this, and so that's usually something like that is what inspires me, to do more, for my wife or for, the woman I'm with. That's how a woman inspires a man. That's how a woman is inspirational. It's something that's natural. It's not something that's forced. It's not something like that needs to be communicated. It's something that's natural. When a woman wants more for herself, the man is going to position himself, to be able to do more for her. You don't even have to talk about it. It's just, that's how women inspire men. You know what I mean? And it's just crazy to me, you got all these women out here talking about they want ambitious men and all this kind of stuff, but they don't do anything to nurture that. They don't do nothing to support that. You see what I'm saying? And so they out here looking for men who already have it together and stuff like that. And for the most part, a man is not usually going to be ambitious, for the most part, unless he's being driven by standards of society, which most men are, and that's why a lot of them are failing. But for the most part, most men aren't going to be inspired to be anything more if they don't have anything to strive towards, and that's the problem. All these women out here trying to look for ambitious men and all that kind of stuff. What's the point of being ambitious? It's sort of the same thing like I stated before in some of my older videos and stuff like that. Before I had a wife and kids, I wasn't making a lot of money, because I really didn't need to. That's how life works. Whenever a need arises, you have to step up to meet it. You see what I'm saying? And it's the same thing when it comes, to like inspiration. How women are inspirational to men and stuff like that. If a woman expresses, I want to do this, I want to go here, I want to do that. You may not have the means for it. You see her desire, and you want to make her happy. You know what I mean? And so you strive to be better or to meet that need. You see what I'm saying? That's how women are inspirational, to men and stuff like that. And like I said, I don't understand the deal with modern society always trying to look for inspirational men and stuff like that. Most men out here don't have anything to be ambitious about. You know what I mean? What drove me when I was younger is the idea of eventually having a family. You know what I mean? That's what drove me in the past. That was like the inspiration, that I had to be ambitious, because I wanted to provide a certain lifestyle for my kids and my family one day. I always wanted to have a large family. I'm type of one of those people who wanted to have a kid every single year, because that's the, thing with humanity. We spend our whole life searching for purpose and stuff like that. And modern society tells us that relationships are based on something that they're not. You see what I mean? And we have this whole idea in modern society that relationships are about a male, just the man and the woman and stuff like that. They make the family. That's not true. Our whole drive is procreation, to increase. You know what I mean? And so a lot of these type of relationships and stuff like that, you can also blame, but yes, it's harder, to have a lot of kids and stuff, and like the way the economy is, but that's different in modern times than it was in the past. That's why we had most of our families, like our mom's mom or our father's father, they come from households with 9, 12 kids. You know what I mean? And that's the thing that drove them. That's the thing that held people together. That's why we see so much depression and so much negativity in modern society, is because we're living a lie. You know what I mean? So like these families, I grew up in families where we had multiple families in one household and stuff like that, and it was never a dull moment. You know what I mean? And that's what I always wanted, you know, to have family like that, where we're having a kid every single year, to have a house full of kids, all these personalities. You know, there's never a dull day. There's always something that needs to be done. There's always somebody with a need, you know, because this is the type of thing that distracts us in life from this whole pursuit of purpose. You know what I mean? Because that's what it is. You know, when you have all these kids and you're going through having to provide for them, there's a need that needs to be met. This is what drives us purpose. You know, this is what drives us to be ambitious and all these different things. You know, it gives us something to strive, something to move towards. You know what I mean? But when you don't have no house, no kids in the house, and you just working to pay bills, you know, women and men start to see how different we are. You know what I mean? And that's the whole thing that we get caught up in modern times. You know, that's why elderly couples, they're always traveling, they're always out doing something, always around other people, because when they sit in the house with each other, they understand how different they are. You know what I mean? Just like in nature, opposites attract. You know what I mean? And just like when it comes to developing the children, opposites attract to produce a well-balanced individual. Life is about balance. You know what I mean? And so that's why I've always wanted to have kids in the house and stuff like that, because when you're distracted with kids, you don't pick up on how different we are. You know, the relationship is not based on the man and the woman. It's based on all the other factors that has to come in. That's why society, like everything about us, is built upon procreation. You see it in the wild. You know what I mean? The whole reason why we eat, to sustain ourselves, the whole reason why we go out and eat, is to feed our family so they can continue to procreate, so they can continue to increase. All of it is all built around procreation. You see what I'm saying? And that's why I've been even talking about lately about sex and stuff in a lot of my comments on Facebook and all these other social media platforms, you know, because it's like in society today we have minimized how important sex is, you know, and there's a lot of things that go into the degradation that we see in society today, you know, and it's all based on improper development or arrested development, because people aren't getting what they need. You know, many of us are growing up without parents. Our parents aren't teaching us how to be husbands and wives. Nobody knows anything, you know what I mean? We've completely lost our way, you know what I mean? And it's just crazy, you know, even what's going on with, you know, with modern relationships falling apart and constant divorces and stuff like that. Women have stepped completely away from their role. They don't even know what they are anymore. They over here acting like men. They think like we do. You know what I mean? Dating is horrible. You know, I'm currently, you know, dating and stuff like that, and it's like just the dating is horrible. Women act like men now. They expect men to hold full conversations, to chase them, do all this kind of stuff, when that's not our nature. We don't do that. You know what I mean? And you know, it's horrible just trying to hold conversations with these women. I remember growing up when I used to date younger girls and stuff like that. They used to be all about you. You know what I mean? Constantly calling you, constantly texting you, letting you know that they're interested in you. Today, women don't do that. They expect you to do that. And if you don't do that, they pretty much, you know, just leave you and go to the next one. You know what I mean? And it's just a constant cycle of doing that. You know, that's why we see so much degradation, you know, when it comes to relationships, you know, because women aren't prioritizing the correct things. Also, in the past, women didn't prioritize money. They didn't prioritize all these different things like they do today. You know what I mean? When it comes to men and women, we are very different. You know, women have completely flipped their role on their head, so now they're doing what we do. They're trying to be independent. They're out trying to go out and work and find jobs to support a family. It's not a woman's role. Women are too tied to their emotions. It's not their role to be out here in survival mode. Us men can handle that because that's the way we're wired. You know what I mean? It's not a woman's role to be constantly in survival mode for the rest of her life. This is what we do. You got to understand that work never stops. You're going to do it until you die. You know what I mean? And women aren't built for that. You know, but through feminism, through all this unnatural ass bullshit, you know what I mean? It's convincing them that this is the way to go, that this is the other option. And this is why we see so much degradation in society and family. You know what I mean? When we talk about all the inflation that's going on right now, there's a lot of different factors that play into it. You know, immigration, you know, the main part I talk about is feminism, due to women not being tied to men anymore. And so they're consuming on the economic market as individuals. You see what I'm saying? When back in the past, we had entire families consuming and sharing things together. It's the same thing with like retirement today. You know what I mean? Modern average wage is around $60,000, and that's on the low end. And so $120,000 is almost around standard wage right now. And so if a person's not making at least $120,000, you're not saving anything for retirement. You see what I'm saying? And so, and you got to think most professions, or not even, I would say professions, most salaries and professions today only pay about average, maybe between $80,000 and $60,000. You see what I'm saying? That's not enough money to save for retirement, even for one person. You got to think like all the expenses and all the things you have to deal with, also with the inflation and insurance and all the other kind of stuff that goes into. That's not a lot of money to save for insurance. You're going to have a huge pitfall in your retirement. You know, average wage right now, you need to be making at least around no less than $50,000 a year in retirement money. You see what I'm saying? That's just to basically survive. You see what I'm saying? And so what happens, you know, when you don't have that money, most people don't even prioritize this, but when we look at the structure, you know, of relationships today, people don't prioritize relationships as survival like they did in the past. And so you got, you know, all these people making $120,000 a year, barely saving for retirement. They don't even calculate that. And so the main way anybody can really get ahead in retirement is by investing and doing all these other kind of things, all these side hustles, and you know, there's just more complexity and more survival mode. You see what I'm saying? And it never works out. You see what I'm saying? And so people don't prioritize that. That's the reason why we see so much, you know, so many resources being utilized, so much, I would say, you know, it's just not enough money to go around for everybody. This is why we see like all the elders and stuff like that, you know, the problems that we're having with healthcare and stuff like that is too damn expensive, because you got all these people consuming on all the public aid. You see what I'm saying? Because they didn't have enough money for retirement. You see what I'm saying? And this is going to get worse and worse the further we go into the future. There might not even be any Social Security and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know why people don't think about retirement. I didn't think about it either. You know, those men like Kevin Samuels, men like Stephen Darby, you know, Alicia Moret, or, you know, teacher Alicia, and all these other men, Charlie Kirk. When I started listening to these men, you know, talk about all these different issues and stuff, that's what got me to kind of wake up and kind of focus on what was going on, you know, because today I wouldn't even been thinking about retirement either, you know, because it's not something you really think about. You know, you don't think about it until it's time for you to retire, or, you know, close to it, when things actually start getting serious about thinking about what you're going to do when you can't work no more, you know, because nobody thinks about it, you know what I mean? And nobody's saving money, because you got to think, even people right now, $250,000 a year can barely even save, you know, for retirement, especially if they got a family and have all these other things going. You see what I'm saying? Nobody's paying attention to that. And so, like I said, the only way to really get ahead is that investments and all these other kind of things, but you still got to have capital for that, which means you can't take that out of your, you know, the pay or your expenses. You know, you got to have a lot of extra money in order to do that. Nobody has extra money, you know, because the wages that we're getting are so low. Anyways, you see what I'm saying? And so nobody prioritizes that. And so when you look at the system today, you see why we are having all these problems, because women are no longer tied to men. We are no longer families. So you got families out here. You got individual men, individual people who are of age consuming on the market, and then you have all these women as individuals consuming on the market. And so look at all these people. You know what I mean? That's why people don't get, that's why a lot of wages and stuff don't pay so much. Just all these wages and salaries have to be split amongst all these people. You see what I'm saying? And nobody really pays attention to it, because like I said before, you know, people barely even $200,000 a year are barely able to. So imagine, you know, somebody who's making anything less than that. You know what I mean? And in the past, that's where it was. Even if a husband and wife had to work, they still consumed and shared everything together. You know what I mean? And so it wasn't as much on the economic system, you know, like it is today, you know, because relationships were like a traditional thing that was prioritized, you know, over all the values that we have today. You know, a lot of this liberal ideology and advanced ways of living, you know, and want to move from nature into this advanced lifestyle, and that's what's destroying us, because you can't change nature. You see what I'm saying? And so just imagine, you know, today, like, standard wage, $60,000 a year. If two people making $60,000 a year and they put their income together, you know what I mean? That's pretty decent. You know what I mean? And so you're making like around $120,000 a year, you know? And so you're able to put something towards retirement doing that, you know, and both of you are consuming together. You know, like when you are up in age, you can't work no more. You know, you spending $30 a day on a meal, y'all both are consuming that meal together instead of having two separate meals equaling $60 every day. You see what I mean? That's how things used to work. That's how the economic system used to be. So that's why I say, you know, yes, there's a lot of factors that go into it. You also have like all these other different things, you know, immigration too. You have people from foreign countries coming over, taking resources from the people who actually live here, you know, and nobody makes a big deal with that. You know, they want to welcome everybody in, and that's that fucking liberal ideology I'm talking about. People of the past understood you don't allow certain people into your country and stuff like that, because they can destabilize your country. They take your resources, you know, just like we've allowed all these other people to come from these countries. They're over here taking all the financial aid. People who over here, Americans, struggling. We can't even get housing and stuff like that in our country, but they're paying for housing from other people to come into the country. You see what I mean? They're not putting the American people first. You see what I'm saying? And it's just crazy that we do shit like that. That's that liberal ideology I'm talking about. And it leads to devastation. You know, that's the problem with nice, good things. If they seem good on the outside, you know, caring for everybody, you know, doing this and that, yeah, it seems good, but you don't pay attention to the bigger picture. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't remember what they used to say, but it's sort of like when you put it like this way, you know, you got somebody who like to care for people. They care for people so much that they don't even care. They don't pay attention to, you know, what's going on in their own life, you know, and so they're giving all their resources, taking care of these people, but they're losing all of theirs. You know, they got family, they got all these other responsibilities and people that they need to look out for, but they over here doing it for them. And so their family goes without, and so they're sacrificing, you know, their family's health or their family's wealth and doing all this kind of stuff. This is exactly what we're doing in this country today. You know what I mean? When you're not looking out for yourself, but want to care give to everybody else and nurture everybody else. You see what I'm saying? Instead of telling these people, hey, you need to get on your feet. You know, all the illegal immigrants, you know, all the Mexicans coming over here. I love Mexican people. You know, I grew up with Mexican people. I was surrounded by immigrants, you know, growing up and stuff. I know a lot, you know, about them. We both was like almost in the same struggle coming up, you know, because we had nothing. We were in poverty too, you know, being, you know, from in Black America and stuff like that. And so we come from the same place, you know, so I sympathize with them. But at the same time, you know what I mean? They're coming over here, you know, and taking all the resources from all the other minorities over here. You know what I mean? So I'm not like for just, oh, these people are in their country are suffering, you know, let's bring them all over here. You know, I'm more for let's do what we need to do to get your economic system back on track and get your country back on track so you can have the same prosperity like we have here. You know, so I'm more for that than just having all these people come in. And that's what I'm talking about. People don't look at the big picture. People in modern society has become too emotional. Modern society has actually been more feminized than anything, because that's all you look around, that's all you see. You see caregiving, nurturing, pacification, tolerance, all these different things. You know what I mean? Growing up, you know, even without having a father, I understood that there needs to be correction. If you don't correct behavior, if you don't correct things that are negative, eventually, you know, these things get out of control and they lead to a lot of chaos. And that's what we see in a lot of people's lives and stuff like this. You don't correct behavior. You know what I mean? You allow children to decide what they want to be sexually and all these kind of things. You know, you can't change biology. Like I say, you can't change nature. That's why we starting to see, all the problems these people have. We already know what's going on inside their head. They over here on TV, on all these social platforms trying to hide. I know the way the subconscious works. I've studied the subconscious works. Even in myself, I know how it works. These people are hurting and they're over here trying to hide it, because they're trying to make something wrong right. You know what I mean? Every time they look into a mirror, they know what they are, but they try to deny it. We're not stupid. You know what I mean? And so that's what's going on in society and stuff like that, and it's leading to a lot of degradation we see. Women, due to the suffrage movement and all the different women's movements, they've been separated so far from their nature. People didn't understand. Like I talked about in one of my older videos, that when these women go out for these jobs, when they go to these high professions in college, you have to learn a certain type of discipline. That discipline is masculine in nature. And so when women go out, become doctors, lawyers, and all these positions, where they're in some form of authority, they learn masculine traits. Those masculine traits become their profession. Though profession becomes their life, and that profession in their life, they bring that home into their relationships. You see what I'm saying? And also, in general, modern society, has adopted this idea that a strong woman or an independent woman is a strong woman. You know what I mean? And that's not the case, because that goes against a woman's nature. It's a woman's role. It's a woman's nature to be vulnerable, to be weak, to be perplexed, to be all these different kind of things, And this is what drives men to women. When I was younger, that's why I used to love little younger girls. When I used to date in school and stuff like that, because I seen how weak they were. I seen how vulnerable they were. I see that they needed protection. I seen that they needed provision. All these different things. This is what drove a man. This is what drove me to women. But today, the way a woman behaves, with this independent attitude, this aggression and all these type of things, they're assertive and want to put that dominance over you. They're competitive and doing all these kind of things like us men do to each other. When a man does that to me, we fight for leadership, but in our own relationships, in our households, we can't fight women. And so the only thing we can do as gentlemen is literally neglect her, to turn away from her, to ignore her, push her away, or avoid her. That's the only way. The subconscious is screaming out, this is pain. When the subconscious is met with any type of pain, it doesn't know if it's physical pain or if it's emotional pain. All it knows is pain, and it begins to associate that person with pain. Stay away from her. Push her away. If we don't get into an argument or a debate with her, we don't have to go through this pain. Subconsciously, and instinctually, that becomes our way. After constantly dealing, with all these different kind of things. You know what I mean? And nobody teaches that. We are so caught up in this modern advanced way of thinking, where we look at science studies and all these kind of things and think that we are above instinct and nature, when we're not. We're still driven by instinct and nature. You know what I mean? And it's like nobody pays attention to that. And that's the reason why we have so much devastation in our relationships today, because women don't know what men are. When you conversating with a woman and stuff like that, she's thinking that you comprehend, or that you think, or that you talk or communicate on a level that she does, when we don't. Our attention span is only 10 minutes as men. You know what I mean? So you telling us all these long stories, all these things that you've already told us 100 times, we get bored very quickly with that. You know what I mean? And women take that as, oh, you don't like me, you don't care anything about me, you don't communicate with. We don't communicate on that level. You know what I mean? It's not our job to do that. You know what I mean? Also, with the deal with validation, a lot of women today crave validation because their fathers didn't correctly validate them when they were growing up. That's a form of development that a lot of women today skipped out on, and so they rely on validation from their men, and men are not taught to validate women. You know what I mean? It's not our nature to validate women. You see what I'm saying? And this is also another thing that leads to a lot of the ending of a lot of relationships. Because women feel as though they're not getting affection. It's not our role to be affectionate. You see what I'm saying? Because women have to understand that we're not like them. Feminism is over here trying to teach everybody that men and women are the same. We're not the same. We don't think the same. We don't do things the same. We don't reason the same. We're completely different. You see what I'm saying? And there's a lot of compromises being made in order to hold society together in this dysfunction. You see what I'm saying? And so we're taking a lot of these things thinking that they're natural, but they're not. You see what I'm saying? Like the beta male, for instance. Beta males is not something. Beta males is like a modern creation. You know, weak men. Men have always been strong. This is the way we have been. Always. You know, that's why we see our families falling apart, because they're being led by weak men. You see what I'm saying? That's why our daughters can't find suitable husbands, because these men are weak. They don't teach their boys how to be men, how to persevere, how to do all these things. You know, you got all these men who want to be entrepreneurs, not get an actual labor job, not actually do something with their hands. You know what I mean? They don't teach that anymore. They teach this weakness. They teach everything is about finance, you know, and all this other kind of stuff. That's weakness. You know what I mean? They're, like I said, life is about balance. You got to have balance in everything. You know what I mean? And it's just crazy. The modern society, like the women out here, they're just chasing after men with money. These men don't have time for you. I used to be a business owner myself. I had no time for anything. I hated it. You know what I mean? I had no time for my family. I had no time for myself. It was all about money, this and that. I had to make sure I had money to cover this if something went wrong. I just got tired of it. On top of the stuff when I'm already taking on a household and I have to do the same thing. You see what I mean? There's a lot of stress in that. There's a lot of gambling. You know, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. You got to have backup plans and all this and that. I mean, and on top of that is the work requirement. In order to make a lot of money, you know, skills are compensated. You get compensated for your skills, how to do something. You know what I mean? And so that's what working all these hours is doing. You know, you being paid for a skill, something you know how to do. You know what I mean? And these people don't have time for relationships. Doctors, lawyers, these people don't have no time for no relationships. That's why they're in and out of marriages constantly. Constantly always talking about divorces. With celebrities, what's going on? Oh, the new divorce, new marriage, new divorce, new marriage, new divorce. This is the way these people live. They don't have time for it. You know what I mean? But that's what everybody's striving for, you know? I don't care for that kind of stuff, you know? I wouldn't even mind to be like the type of person, you know, in the woods somewhere in Asia, as long as I had a woman, a traditional woman, you know, and had a large family. You know, I wouldn't mind getting up every day, going out working with my hands, you know, building that life, you know, building houses and building the community out there. That's the kind of lifestyle that I like. You know what I mean? I don't care about all this money and all this, you know, this other garbage. It's all pointless. When you even, like, especially when you start thinking about, like I was talking about with retirement, you got all these people spending money on these bags, Gucci, old clothes, shoes, cars that depreciate in value unless you keep getting a new one every year, putting a couple $1,000s with it. It's pointless. Like, literally the only thing that even maintains value in our society is pretty much houses. You know what I mean? It's all pointless. You're just wasting your money. And when you get to retirement age and can't work no more, you gotta work. I mean, you have to live off of all the money you should have been saving during that time. So all these people who've been out spending all these money on shoes, going on all these trips, all that money's fucking gone, and you didn't save shit for retirement. So what you gonna do? You're gonna be out here struggling like everybody else. You know what I mean? And this shit is just pointless. You know what I mean? Just pointless. All the clubbing, the partying, and it's pointless. Vanity. That's all it is. You know what I mean? It's just all fucking pointless. You know, that's why I don't strive after that kind of stuff. You know, I just want me to find me a simple woman. You know, a feminine, simple woman. Just like in the past. Just like my great-great-great-grandmother, you know, who listened to her husband and, you know, tracked, you know, where the family led to where we are today. Where we came from, where our mothers and fathers came for households when there was 12 kids. You know what I mean? And they maintained that better than we do in modern society, even during the time of Jim Crow and slavery. You know what I mean? They had it better than we have it today. You know, look at our communities, look at our kids. You know what I mean? It's a shame. You got all these women, 6, 7 kids with no freaking husband. You know? How's she gonna find a relationship in that? You know what I mean? It's just a shame, man. You know? And it kind of pisses me off too, you know, because you got all these lame ass dudes, these weak-minded men who don't know nothing about responsibility, no perseverance or anything, having all these fucking kids. They got 12 kids, you know, like that. That's the kind of lifestyle I wanted. I wanted to be one woman, you know, and have a child every single year. That's what I wanted. You know what I mean? But look at all these dudes, all these kids with all these multiple women, and they over here destroying these women's lives. These women are allowing it. You know, I'm not trying to put the blame on the men. It's also they allowed that shit too. They both at fault. You know what I mean? But it's crazy. You know? And like everywhere I look, I can't find any single women. You know? There's always women with children wanting you to take on somebody else's responsibility. And I can't stand that shit. You know what I mean? I can't stand it. It's crazy. You know what I mean? And it's hard to find women who are actually traditional. All these women claim to be traditional, but they don't actually know what that means. You know what I mean? A lot of them don't, because they're so far out of their nature. I mean, you have to understand, like, go back and look, like in the 50s, the 40s, and see how these young girls were. See how these women were. They're nothing like they are today. You know, look how sexualized women have become. I remember 10 years ago, women were complaining, talking about how over-sexualized they were. You know what I mean? And now look at it today. Men, we over here trying to slow the sexualization of women down, and they over here pushing the shit. You know, everywhere you go on Facebook, all you see is ass and titties, and you think men out here pushing that shit. No, it's the women. You know what I mean? They're advertising the product. You know what I mean? And how did that happen? It happened because women became sexualized when they started to act like men. They started to do what we do as men, but don't understand that there's differences. You know what I mean? A woman is not a man. You don't just go out and have sex with all these women. You know, you can't wash all these people off of you or out of you like a man does. These people become a part of you. You know, today we learned that men's sperm goes into the bone marrow of a woman. Like all these men you've been with, their seed is still inside of you. Their DNA is a part of you, and you wonder why when you have kids that your kids look very different than you. And they're over here complaining, talking about this genetics. We pull back. No, you got so many people's DNA inside of you. You know, that's why your kids come out looking crazy. You know what I mean? It's just, we know this now. You know, they've been known that. You know, and I tell you, you know, like I've been doing a lot of research over the past, actually 7 years, but I really got deep into it about 4 years ago. And I've been doing a lot of them. I know science has always been my thing. Engineering, science, mathematics, all those kind of things. You know, all my life, I've always been into engineering, you know. And I've always studied. I study everything. You know, I've always strived to be like the great men that I used to idolize, like Albert Einstein and all these people. You know, I used to study all their works and all that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? I strive to be like them. You know, I used to read the Bible, you know, talk about there will be no greater than Solomon. I used to read all these other books saying that nobody can learn or know everything, you know, but I set out to prove that wrong, you know, and to this day, I know something about everything, you know what I mean? I know something about everything. I'm not a specialist. I don't know everything about everything. I don't know the special details. I don't know like the intricate pieces of somebody who spends their whole life studying something. But I know something about everything. You know, that's always been my drive in life, to know something about everything. You know, that's why when I started my business, you know, I always called it Antoine's General Repair. It started off as a car repair service, you know, mechanical, and then I upgraded to all these other kind of things, you know, industrial to appliance and all this other kind of stuff, because I wanted to start an engineering firm, like literally a general engineering firm, just like G&E. You know, that's why I called it Antoine's General Repair, not Antoine's Automotive Repair or something like that specific, because I wanted a general company. I wanted to build a general law firm, not law firm, but engineering firm. You know, that makes all forms of different type of engineering products and stuff like that. You know, and you know, it's always been my role. You know, I always called myself a general engineer. You know, because I know many different forms of engineering: electrical, mechanical, civil. It doesn't matter. Chemical. Just all different forms. I know something about everything, you know, and that's been my drive in life. And yeah, and so like it wasn't till about 6 years ago that I started to see contradictions in a lot of stuff I used to believe about science and stuff. And I looked into science. I've seen a lot of assumptions being made that I really didn't pick up on before, because at that time I was kind of on autopilot, just consuming information and not analyzing it or reasoning within the information itself. You know, I've never thought to go back and actually look at contradictory evidence of anything. You know, I've always been led by institutions and generalized mainstream information. You see what I mean? I never looked at the other side, but once you start looking at the other side, you know, just the same thing in court. You can't just, somebody just doesn't come in the courtroom and say, hey, this and happen. You got to see the evidence. You got to see, you got to cross-witness the witnesses and all this kind of stuff to get to the truth, you know. And that's the way a lot of this stuff is. This is when we look at a lot of events in history and stuff like that, you only see one side of it, because remember, history is written by the victors of wars or the victors of a conflict. It's not written by those who lost the conflict. And so the history is always going to be in the favor of those, you know, who won it. And it's not until we get to modern times do we have all these other eyes looking in, you know. But in the past, especially like, you know, before the 1500s and stuff like that, you've always only seen one side. It wasn't until modern times that we have, you know, all these other devices and other people record keeping and all that kind of stuff, where if somebody told a lie, it could be debunked, or you know, people could bring this into some form of council where they can decide on the information. You know, it wasn't until modern times that we started doing that. So a lot of the history, especially ancient history, is only one-sided. But there is information out there, you know, and that's what you need to look at when you do all these kind of all this kind of research on science and all the different laws and things that we believe in, because there's a lot of assumptions being made, you know, and there's also a lot of things that's being put in place to uphold other laws and stuff like that. You know what I mean? That's the whole idea with the flat earth and all this other kind of stuff, you know, these kind of conspiracy theories they call it. But I don't see those as conspiracy theories because the theories they're not settled. They're not closed. They're open. The information, the laws, the principles, everything is open. You see what I'm saying? We keep talking about all these things with gravity, but gravity can't be proven. And all the instrumentation that we use to prove it has not yielded any evidence for it. So gravity can exist or it can't exist. It's at a place where it does or doesn't exist. People or institutions are the ones who set forth the beliefs in if something is real or not. Gravity can't be confirmed at all. And so, yeah, we have all these little things that we do. You know, we use all these different tests and all these kind of things, but even the methods of those tests are open. You see what I'm saying? And so it's like, it could be either or. But that's the thing with it. You know, when it comes to all this kind of stuff with the flat earth, you know, I wasn't sold on it. I'm like, that's flat earth. That sounds crazy. It sounds two-dimensional when we live in a three-dimensional world. But when you really think about it, that's when they show you these things, you know, the mainstream narrative is what they want you to believe. And so they're only going to show you what they want you to believe. So when they used to show all these photos of the flat earth or what flat earthers believe, they always show some flat disc. That's not what flat earthers believe the earth is. You have to think of like a snow globe. You know, we used to all have those little snow globes with the little snowman in it, and you know, with the water in it, with the little I don't know what it is, plastic or some sort, but when you shake it, it'll start snowing in the globe, and the particles will float down to the bottom. And so that's the model that most flat earthers believe. So when somebody's saying that the earth is flat, they're not talking about it being some two-dimensional flat disc. But that's the thing. Because you got to look at things sort of like through baby's eyes. Because that's the problem with modern society. We all are philosophers and have this scientific mindset where we're just advanced beings. We're no longer attached to nature and stuff. We're beyond that. No, we're not. You see, and that's the problem that we're going through, because we have that type of mindset. We have separated ourselves from nature. You can't separate yourself from nature. Nature is our reality. Nature is our existence. You can't separate yourself from it. And nature has a way and a structure that it plays out all of its functions, and it can't be changed. You can never water plants without what it needs. You know what I mean? You can synthesize things, but it's always going to be what that plant needs. Otherwise, it's not going to work. That means you can't change nature, but we think that we can. And this is the type of lifestyle that we are living. That's what feminism is. Feminism is not natural. These women are out of their nature. That's why they can't get along with men, because they are men. You see what I mean? Us men don't get along with each other intimately. We're territorial. We're competitive. We're all these different things. And this is what we're experiencing in our relationships. You see what I'm saying? And we have to treat women different because they're not men. We can't go out and fight women like we do other men because they're doing these things that we dislike. We can't fight for leadership. Subconsciously, we look at women as weak, vulnerable, and all these kind of things. That's why in society, it's frowned upon if you attack a woman like you would a man, because they're weak. That's their nature. And so when we're dealing with these things in our relationship, we can't fight women. So the only thing we can do is push them away. You see what I mean? Ignore them so we don't get in conflict with them. You know what I mean? And that's what we're seeing. And so we're keep living these advanced lifestyles, not looking at the degradation that's going on. When a child grows up without a father, women have to play two roles. I talk about this a lot. I used to be a YN myself. Grew up 30 minutes from Chicago. That's where I'm from. That's what I did. I experienced that. You know what I mean? I grew up without a father. My father was there, but he wasn't there. You know what I mean? And so I was growing up with my mom. I became the head of my household. I was a product of the nexus effect that I talk about. You have this nexus, and then you have all these different possibilities that shoots out from it. You see what I'm saying? The nexus is being the single mother. You see what I mean? There's many different role possibilities that come out of that. And the main one I usually talk about is the YN. I used to be one. People don't understand that you can love somebody and hate them at the same time, because we don't know nothing about the subconscious. And so eventually a woman has to play two roles. She can't be a nurturer and also be a punisher or protector. That's why you have two separate parents. They're different. You need both things from both of them. In nature, opposites attract. You know what I mean? And it produces balance. You see, when you neutralize an acid with a base, it creates balance, neutrality. You see what I mean? And that's what's going on in everything. Life is about balance everywhere. You can't be one-sided. Life is about balance. You know what I mean? And so when it comes to, these women raising these kids on their own, it doesn't matter if the father's still there. Once you break up that household, their development is arrested, and people understood that. Especially, you still have interviews of psychologists and doctors and scientists of all these people in the past, who talked about this, that once you break up a family unit, once a child is in the household with the father and the mother, that's proper development. Once you separate that, it doesn't matter if y'all co-parenting in separate households. It does not matter. It doesn't matter if the father's there doing everything you need to do. That child's development is arrested. You know what I mean? Because we have lost our way. We don't understand that children do what they see. Everything is based on what you see, what you're involved in. All people who brought up and broke into this are going to be broken. That's how people learn, by what they see. Just like all the stuff you learn in college. You don't hold on to that information unless you go through a practice. You have to practice it in order to remember it, in order to build your skills. You know what I mean? That's why education is pointless. All the stuff that we learn through education is stuff we use on a day-to-day basis. You know what I mean? You're not really learning anything. You know what I mean? That's how people who are homeschooled learn. You know, they interact with the world around them. And they deal with these things. They go out and deal with the world on those same terms that people who are sitting in these 12-year institutions are doing. You know what I mean? But anything outside of that, if you don't exercise it, you're not going to remember it. You know what I mean? Because it's about what you do. It's about what you see, what you're involved with. You know what I mean? That's what forms your development. And so a mother can't play both roles. Either the nurturing is going to be canceled out, or her correction is going to be canceled out. You see what I'm saying? And so when I talk about that nexus, there's many possibilities that come out of that. You have boys who grew up to be, and I don't usually talk about the female aspect because I'm not a female, but I can suspect that it's literally about the same thing. You know, because I know what fathers do for daughters and stuff like that, and I can perceive that it would be about the same thing. You know, they may do something a little bit differently. That's why I don't usually speak on the female aspect of it. I always talk about the, boys and stuff like that, because that's what I experience and that's what I know. And so, when a mother is, nurturing a boy without a father and stuff like that, like I said, it doesn't matter if the father's still there. You're gonna see that. You get these kids, who go over to their father's house. The father's too hard on them. Why is he too hard on them? Because he don't have a wife to tell him, husband, you need to be a little more like this. You need to be more like that. That's the balance. That's why a man comes to a woman. Like me, I'm literally an instinctual man. My wife talked about it all the time. About my mannerisms, how they don't react, how they don't connect with other people's modern mannerisms, because I'm a man. I'm 100% alpha male masculine, natural. I don't lead my life based on any form of modern ideology on the way people should be or anything like that. They're telling men they need to be more sensible, need to be more gentle. I don't do that. You know what I mean? I do instinctually what I am, and that's the only thing you can be. You can only be what you are. I tell people that all the time. You can put on this front all you want to, but when you home alone and you relax, you're going to be who you are. So you can put on this front for everybody else and go out and live the world fake. All you're doing is adding stress to your life. You know what I mean? You can only be who you are. And so who you are can only be found from within. Sorry about that. I had a distraction. What was I talking about? I was talking about YNs. Yeah, I was talking about the process of YNs. So, like when a woman has to play dual roles, eventually one of those roles sometimes get canceled out. You know what I mean? It's like this whole subconscious thing that happens. This is subconscious. People don't study the subconscious, and when some people do talk about the subconscious, it always tends to be spiritualist, and they talk about it in the form of spirit, in a spiritual form. But the subconscious is a biological thing. It's literally like the mind of the body. You have to, the way I like to think about it is like the modern cars today. The modern cars today use engine computers or ECUs or PCMs. They got a lot of different names for them. But basically what these devices do, they're like computers. And these computers receive information from all these different peripherals, like the steering gearbox, a lot of different things, all different kind of modules, the foot pedals. Like in modern cars, when you hit the accelerator pedal, you're not hitting a pedal that's attached to a cable that's connected to a throttle body or a carburetor. You know what I mean? On these newer cars, the foot pedal, the actual acceleration pedal, is just a peripheral device. It's just a switch. You know what I mean? And so that switch sends information to the ECU through all these different modules. You know what I mean? And it communicates with all these different modules. The computer's what's driving the car. You see what I'm saying? And so it inputs information, and then it changes the environment of the system in order to carry out those functions. It's the same thing with like our subconscious. Our subconscious does the same thing. It takes in information and it does all these calculations and it does stuff. You know, we tend to think about the brain as just this whole thing. You know, but it's almost like the brain has a personality. It's called the subconscious. You see what I'm saying? And so the subconscious is like the computer that's inputting all this information and all these things. It does a lot of reasoning as well. And that's what people don't understand. And so like the consciousness that identifies as you is literally your waking consciousness. The consciousness that's identifying that who you are. And so what most people do spiritual is they look at the subconscious as this form of the actual form of self, while this other consciousness is something else. You know, but your waking consciousness is actually who you are. The subconscious is actually a part of the body. And so when you deal with a lot of different traumas and things like that coming up, the subconscious is working, taking in the information. Just like I was talking about in our relationships, when a woman is constantly competing with a man, constantly arguing with them, constantly being uncooperative, constantly being aggressive and all these different kind of things, that his subconscious is taking that information in, and it starts to identify her as a source of pain or a source of dysfunction. And the subconscious will get him to literally start avoiding her. You know, that's the way our brains work. You know, and so like if you keep if you stub your toe or slam your finger in the door, you're going to pull your hand back and say, ouch. You're not going to keep putting your hand in there and keep slamming the door because it's painful. You know what I mean? And so the subconscious works like the same way. You know, so the subconscious is actually, you know, a part of that process. You know, you do things that verbally, you say things, you do things physically, you know, and the body has these type of autonomic functions. That's the subconscious that's driving that. You see what I'm saying? And so like when you're going through all these traumas as a child where you aren't able to comprehend things and stuff like that, and your subconscious is still developing and your brain is still developing and stuff like that, you don't know what things are. You interpret things incorrectly. The brain sees certain things as pain or certain things as obstacles. There's a lot of mess there. That's why we need to have proper development as children that we're not getting in modern society. Because that's what's leading us to all the problems that we go through, all the phobias, all the conditions and mental disorders that we go through when we get older. You see what I'm saying? Because our development is being arrested or interrupted. And that also works on a physical aspect as well. When you're not getting what you need. Just like when you have a baby or whatever, and you're not giving the baby nutrients that it needs. The body has to compensate. You see what I'm saying? And pull nutrients from other things that may be less vital, which leads to something else being underdeveloped. You see what I mean? And we don't pay attention to any of these things in society. And so this is what's driving a lot of the things that we deal with. Like I said, we're too far away from nature. We don't think logical anymore. We're too far. We think we're too advanced for nature. And so we don't pick up on these things. You know, just like, you know, all these liberals doing all this crazy stuff today. They don't pick up on the fact that what they're doing makes no sense. You see what I'm saying? And it's like they're just going off of their emotions. You know what I mean? And so they're overlooking common sense or logic. You see what I'm saying? And everybody else is pointing this out, you know? And then they think somebody's attacking them, you know, when we're just literally pointing out logic. Because you too involved in your emotions. That's what's the problem with modern society. It's too snowflake. It's too weak. There's no correction in modern society. Anybody can do what they want. Anybody can think what they want to think. You know what I mean? Fantasy is not real. We can't bring fantasy into reality, but that's the way we think today. You know, nobody corrects that behavior. And so everybody's out here living a fantasy and want everybody else to accept it. You see what I'm saying? But not to go too far off topic, you know, that's what's going on. The subconscious is doing a lot of things. And so when you're going through trauma as a child and stuff like that, you know, not having a father being in this situation, that's why you see also when parents get a divorce, you start seeing the kids act up. in school and start attacking people and become bullies and all that kind of stuff because they're dealing with something in their subconscious. Something that's not right. Something that's disrupting their development, something they can't understand. You know what I mean? And that's what happens. It's the same process that these single mothers do when they create YNs. YN is not the only product. You also have boys who grew up to be submissive to women. You have boys who grew up to be aggressive and take advantage of women. And also they become the head of the household and all these different kind of things. There's a lot of possibility. That's why I talk about this nexus with all these different possibilities that comes from it. But it's not ever just one thing. And also a lot of the things that I talk about are extremes. Not everybody turn out that way. You might have different aspects of different ones. But these are just extremes. You know what I mean? And so and it makes sense that the extreme would be the stereotype for a specific people, because the majority of us go through the same thing, right? A lot of us, especially in the Black community, grow up without fathers. It's just something that's become almost normalized to us, and we go through this stuff. And so the negative aspects of that is always going to be the majority. That's why the majority of our stereotype comes from the negative aspects or the negative people of our culture or our ethnic group. You see what I mean? That's why thugs and criminals and all these kind of stuff, that's why we get labeled like that, because they are the majority of us, because the majority of us goes through that process. You see what I'm saying? And so that's just what it is. And so like I talked about before, the mother's nurturer get canceled out. And so the kid's subconscious elevates his mother to this goddess status. You know what I mean? But also his subconscious sees her as a punisher, meaning somebody who's literally attacking him or belittling him. Because this is another thing that a lot of women do in the modern relationship too. They treat us like little boys. You know what I mean? If I'm a man leading the household and doing all these things, I expect her to trust me. I expect her to rely on me, not constantly question what I'm doing, where I'm going, as though I don't know what I'm doing. You know what I mean? That's what women do, or mothers do, to their little boys. That's negative. You know what I mean? And so when you're in a household with a father and stuff like that, there's a balance there. There's an imbalance when you battering your child. What are you doing? Doing that. Don't do this. Don't do that. You got to allow children to develop on their own, use their own reason. Because you can't teach people reason. Reason is something that has to happen within. You know what I mean? Because when you do that, you're over here like you're training an animal. We're not like that. We have a different type of consciousness than animals. And so you have to nurture that. And so that's one of the things, even to today, that I identify in my own subconscious that I can't stand that women do to me. You know what I mean? Where are you going? What you doing? I hate when people do that to me. And it stems from what my mom did to me when I was younger. You see what I mean? And when somebody's doing that to me, I completely push them away or alienate them. And when I'm in a relationship with somebody doing that, you can see that being a problem. And like I said, the subconscious is working, and these things are almost like instinctual. So it's not something that you always have control over. It's just like breathing, right? When you're breathing, you don't know that you're breathing. Your body is naturally breathing. Like your mind, your brain is taking over that type of autonomic function. You don't recognize your breathing. You don't pay attention to it. But once you start paying attention to your breathing, you start taking over breathing. You see what I mean? And if you don't keep up the rhythm, you fall out of rhythm, you get short of breath. You see what I mean? Then all you have to do is forget about it. Don't pay attention to your breathing. Then the body starts breathing on its own again, and it restores the rhythm. You see what I'm saying? That's what it's like. That's what a lot of the things like when we go through marriage counseling. Your wife saying, oh, you're doing this, oh, you're doing that. When we're in the house arguing, we can't identify that because subconsciously we're not aware of it, because we are being driven by our instinct or by our subconscious, and also using our normal conscious. And so we're not aware of it. That's why I said that that's the cycle. Women complain about being neglected by men once the relationship is starting to go sideways. And of course, most men will pick up on this every once in a while, but we're not really aware of it. You know what I mean? Because, like I said, it's an autonomic process. All the conflict that this woman has put you through, your subconscious is identifying her. This is the source of the problem. Stay away from her. It's not that we're thinking that. The subconscious isn't giving us the ability to see that, because we are mostly only in touch with our waking consciousness. You know, that's the thing. Oh, what I'm going to do? You know, what am I going to eat? You know, I feel like doing this. I feel like doing that. That's the conscious that we're in touch with. We're not in touch with the subconscious, but we do get glimpses in every once in a while. You know what I mean? And so, all the things that we do becomes autonomic. We're not aware of it. It's just like breathing. You know what I mean? But when you go through marriage counselings, a lot of the counselors and stuff like that get you to, you know, focus on that. That's what's going on. Or they show you this video. This is what you were doing. You know, then we see that, and then we become aware of it, and then we try to adjust or compromise, you know, and so we start doing that. But eventually we forget about it in the body or the subconscious. If the situation hasn't improved, it goes back to its normal programming. You see what I mean? And so that's why, you know, a lot of times marriage counseling don't work. It's because we're not being taught how to be these individuals. You know, when you go to marriage counseling, they don't tell you what you are, because we don't function on what we are. That's what I'm saying, that this whole society has become so advanced that we don't function on our base level. We keep trying to reach for this higher aspect of ourselves. You know what I mean? When that's not what we are. We're still animals, just like the rest of the animals, driven on instinct. You know what I mean? But we push that to the side, and it's like, no, we're better than that. You can be better, or you can think that you're better than that all you want, but everything about you is going to continue to function like that. That's what I talk about. It's like this lifestyle that we're living, it supersedes the normal reality that we live, and that's why people are living in fantasies. You see what I'm saying? But that's not how reality works. You see what I'm saying? And so it's like, I keep getting off topic. I hate that. Let me get back on topic. Yeah, so like, eventually the nurturing gets canceled out or whatever. This boy gets to see his mother, or the Punisher. Eventually he begins to have this resentment, anger, and almost like hate towards his mother. But at the same time, he also loves his mother and elevates her to this goddess. You see what I'm saying? And this is a lot of things that drives the indifference and added the anger and the I don't care attitude and stuff like a lot of the YNs have and stuff like that. That's where that comes from. You see what I'm saying? Where they only focus on themselves and stuff like that, you know, and that's that's another reason why when you start to actually sit down and talk with a lot of these individuals, they think that nobody cares for them. They think nobody likes them because of that type of resentment. Because if your mother can't love you, it's like that's all you have, you know, and like if she don't love you, then everything is pointless. You know, that's the reason why they do what they do. That's the reason why they don't care about their actions. You know, when they go out and do something, they don't care, because life to them becomes, you know, like this black hole that has no meaning to them. You know what I mean? That's the indifference. You know, that it's only for me. I only care about me and all this kind of stuff. That's where that mindset comes from. You see what I'm saying? And people don't understand that. And you know, like especially when the black community is very different than a lot of these other cultures and stuff like that. We've been through a lot of different things, you know, especially some very devastating things, like even back in slavery, buck breaking and stuff like that, where these slave masters would have certain other slaves rape or beat another slave in front of his family, or the slave master would do it himself, you know, in order to dominate the male of that family, so the woman and the children would see him as weak and not able to protect them. You see what I'm saying? And so they would rely on the slave master to protect them. You know, that's what they do. That's what buck breaking was. They would use a bigger slave to rape or beat another male slave in front of his family, and then the slave master would dominate that slave to make them see that they have no power. You see what I mean? And so we grew up with a lot of that kind of stuff. You know, we were taught that kind of stuff. You know, when I talk about racism shit, the shit happened. You know what I mean? When I talk about racism, you know, a lot of people talking, you know, like like be talking to me like I don't think racism happened. The shit happened, but the way we are living today, the system we live in today, it's not like that. You see what I'm saying? A lot of those things do not take place. You see what I'm saying? Yes, there's always going to be racist people. You know what I mean? You can never get rid of racism 100%, just like you can never have 100% of anything. It's impossible. 100% does exist, but it's not obtainable for humanity. We can never obtain 100%. You know what I mean? You would literally have to be a god to obtain 100%. You would literally have to be the essence of everything to obtain 100%. That's why 100% is not possible. You can never have 100%. There's always going to be racist people. You can't force people to like you. You can't force people to love you. You can't force people to respect you. You can't force people to trust you. Trust and respect is earned. And this modern society is so cushy, so coddled, that they are out here pushing the idea that everybody is reserving of respect. People may be reserving respect, but you can't force somebody to like you. You can't force somebody to trust you or to respect you. Respect and trust is earned. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter if society says, oh, people are human and we're deserving of respect. You can't force somebody to respect you. That's something that's earned. And it's only earned between individuals. You can be in a whole group of people. Just because you earn the respect of one person don't mean that whole group is going to respect you. That's a personal thing. You see what I'm saying? And this is the type of stuff I'm talking about. Your society is pushing a lot of this flawed ideology over nature. Nature is the fact that you can't force somebody to respect you. But society is trying to tell you, oh, everybody is deserving of respect. It doesn't matter. It's nature is what matters. Reality is what matters. Not what you think, not your philosophy. It doesn't matter. You see what I'm saying? But that's what we're doing today. You know what I mean? And that's why we see so much chaos everywhere. And that's, how, these YNs are created. These is what we call them. I used to be one too before I began to reason. I talk about on my last video when I came to this crossroads, when I was having all these anger issues and all these different problems I couldn't understand. I was like, naturally, I wanted to be who I wanted to be, but society was telling me, oh, you can't be that, you can't do that, and I was confused. It drove anger in me for so many years, and eventually one day it just hit me. I was in the kitchen when I was living in Wisconsin. It was, I think my mom and sister was in there, and I remember calling my sister the B word. I ain't never called my sister the B word that I can remember, and I've never been so angry at her and my mom that I was that day. I got so angry I was about to flip the refrigerator over, and as soon as that happened, I was screaming, I was mad, and that was pretty much my personality, because I was going through so much anger at the time. I was in and out of mental institutions and shit like that. And this is the type of stuff that a lot of black kids go through. And they try to say that it's, in the past, they say it was like some mental disorder or something. It's not a mental disorder. It's based on the things that we go through. It's the subconscious trying to deal with things, with all these traumas that we grow up with. You know what I mean? And it just hit me that day. Like, no, you're going to have to choose. You want to be who you are, or you're going to be what society's telling you to be, because they conflict. And that's how I know all this confusion that a lot of these homosexuals and a lot of the confusion all these people with identity crisis is going through. You know what I mean? Because you can't imagine how hard it is for these people, who are trying to be something they're not. I know what that's like, because I used to try to do that. I used to be who I'm not. You know what I mean? But at one point in my life, I had to choose. I'm going to be myself, and that's what I do at all times. And a lot of people don't like that about me, because that's who I am. I'm the serious person all the time. I joke with some people, you know what I mean? But that's not me. I don't joke. I'm not a funny person. I'm serious at all times. I'm educated. I'm strict. I'm logic. That's just the kind of person I am. I keep my eyes on the ball at all times. I analyze every single situation before I make a decision. People call me decisive and stuff like that because I make sure that I make the right choice. That's why I've never failed. It's because I take the time to analyze situations. Back when I was growing up with my mom, all the men she would date are just like these little boys. I'm over here like 12, 14, 15 years old, and I have more common sense. I have more maturity in me than these men do. They're just like little kids. You know what I mean? And that's been my whole relationship with my mom. You know what I mean? I became the head of the household. I became like the logical adult in doing everything. You know what I mean? It's like that's the way we all grow up. We all grow up struggling and stuff like that because people don't know what to do because they're not taught. You have to be taught how to be a man. You have to be taught how to be a woman. You just don't go through life and figure it out. That's what the job of the parents was. They don't do that today. Parents do not teach their children anything they really need to know. They don't teach them their values. They let these people go out here and decide what they want to do. They let them listen to social media to decide who they're going to become. Your children are supposed to be the image of you. You're supposed to teach that. These men are supposed to be teaching their daughters what men are. He is supposed to mimic the man that she's supposed to marry. His daughter is supposed to see him in the man that she's going to marry. That's how she knows that he's worth being with, because she sees her father in him. They don't even do that anymore. You know what I mean? All these girls out here looking for validation. That's why they're chasing after these boys. These boys, they know how to get these women. They just give them what they want. I don't give women what they want. I give them what they need. You know what I mean? And that's the problem. Because people think they know what they need when they don't. You know what I mean? So you try to correct somebody, you shouldn't be doing this, you shouldn't be doing that. No, I want you to agree with me with what I'm doing. I'm not going to agree with you because it leads to devastation. I'm trying to protect you. No, I just can't accept you because you won't trust me in what I'm doing. What you're doing is wrong. You see what I'm saying? And women, they don't like that shit. They're going to go with the person that agrees with them every time. You know what I mean? They're going to go with the person that gives them attention. Like men like me, we are busy. We're busy in college. We're busy in high school building ourselves up to be the person we need to be to support a family, to support a wife and stuff like that. We weren't even paying attention to girls and stuff like that. So they weren't getting a lot of attention from us. You know what I mean? And so, but they chase after the men that give them attention. Who's the one who gives them attention? It's going to be the playboys. It's going to be the thugs. It's going to be all them. That's why they chase after them, because they get that confirmation from them. You see what I'm saying? It's not a man's role to chase a woman. We've all had that beat in our head for so long. That's why men like me, I never chased a woman. Every woman I've ever been with, she found me and she pursued me. You see what I'm saying? Just like in the Bible with Ruth, Boaz. Boaz didn't chase Ruth. You know what I mean? She was interested in him. She showed him that she was interested in him. Boaz was busy taking care of his business, running his farm, and doing all this kind of stuff. He wasn't paying attention to no women. You know what I mean? But once she showed that she was interested, he pursued her and did all that to pursue her. Tried to pay off whatever it was to have her. Because she was supposed to go somewhere else or something like that. He sacrificed for her once he knew that she was interested. That's the way it's supposed to be. That's why good men like me don't usually find women. You see what I mean? Because we're not pursuing them. And women don't understand that. That's the way it was in the past. That's why a lot of the marriages and stuff used to be arranged and stuff like that. But once that arrangement went away because of feminism, once all these different things changed, the whole atmosphere changed. You see what I'm saying? And so now women don't know what they're doing. They're out here doing something that they've never done before and don't know how to do it because it was never their role to do it to begin with. You see what I mean? And so women don't know how to choose men. So they're chasing after all these men with money. These men don't care about you. If the man has to have money, the money has to be his focus. That's why I was saying these men don't have time. All these engineers and scientists, these people have to stay focused on their profession. They don't have time for that. But that's what everybody's chasing. You know what I mean? That's exactly what everybody's chasing. That means that women don't know how to choose men. Look at it in the past. Women didn't choose men with money, physically fit, and all these things. Yes, women lusted after that kind of stuff. But they understood that that's not going to lead to a successful relationship. I need to find somebody who can protect me. I need to find somebody who is stable, established. I need to find somebody who's going to be loyal to me. Who I can trust. All these kind of things. And those are the men that these women used to chase. Some of these men used to be busted up. They used to look like trolls. They used to work in the mines, all that kind of stuff. And these women used to be like models. We look back at history and see all these ugly men with these beautiful women. You know what I mean? That's the reason why, because they understood that back then. They understood that relationships were about survival. You know what I mean? And it's like modern society is just all screwed up, and people don't understand that. And this is why we're seeing so much chaos. You know what I mean? These women, they don't make well over $150,000 a year. They can't save for retirement on their own. So what are they going to do when they get older? They're going to die alone, and they're going to be a burden on their kids. They're going to be a burden on society and everybody else because they didn't want to work with a man. They both could have put their incomes together and consumed together and took care of each other. You see what I mean? That's the way it's supposed to be. But you got all these people out here consuming on this market as individuals, and it's pulling everybody down. This is what was happening to China. With all these single women and stuff like that. And so, that's what's going on. And it's like, this shit is devastating. Everybody's life is being screwed up because of this. You know what I mean? And like I said, women been trying to blame men all this time for all this stuff that's going on, but you can't blame men. Men are not even there. You know what I mean? You can't blame men for all this stuff. I mean, women are the ones who stepped out of their nature. We never stopped being who we were. You know what I mean? What hit us was when these women started acting like us and tried to think that that's going to be a successful relationship. I've never considered being in a relationship with another man because I don't like other men. You know what I mean? I would be fighting another man every single day. And that's exactly what's going on in our relationships. You see what I'm saying? Because women are becoming like men. The way they think is like us. They've completely stepped away from their nature. Women aren't supposed to be anything like what they are today. We're talking about a professional, strong woman. That's a turnoff. Nobody wants to know a professional, strong woman. That's literally the opposite of what you would think of when you think about a woman. You want somebody who's vulnerable, somebody who's weak, perplexed, who need to be led. That's what drives men to a woman. Need. If a woman doesn't need me, I don't need to be around. You know what I mean? There's no reason for me to be with you if there's no need. And that's what I keep talking about. All of us are driven by need. All of us are driven by purpose. If you have no purpose, you have no need, you're in confusion, you're depressed. That's what it is. That's why we go through all these distractions in life. That's why the older generations have so many kids, because those kids are what kept them sane, because they knew that they were different. And as long as you got something to take care of, as long as you got something to distract you from the reality that we're different, things will be okay. You see what I mean? And that's what happens. That's why people are so miserable, in this modern times, is because they think that. I'm sitting up in a relationship, with a woman who only want to have 2 kids. What happens when them kids grow up? What happens when when we're not taking care of them? What happens when we're not changing diapers or taking care of crying babies? What's going to happen? We're going to start to see how different we are. You see what I'm saying? And we're going to start to see that we're not really all that compatible. We're very different. We don't like the same things. We don't do the same things. You know what I'm saying? And you need that, because when opposites attract, it creates balance. When you have 2 people who are the same, you got all these young relationships with these people who are both of them gamers. Both of them have all these same interests and stuff. There's no correction in that relationship. That's why with those type of relationships, you see them, most of those times, those men are called what we call beta males. They're weak men. Why is that? Because the man is not correcting. You know what I mean? There's no correction. People have this idea of this is what love is, to be unified in this type of doing everything together and being together. That's not what love is. Love is, you need correction. You know what I mean? If you love somebody, you correct them to do the right thing. You lead their path. You direct them where they should go. You know what I mean? If you hate somebody, just like you do with your enemies, you know what I mean? If you set a trap, you're not going to warn your enemy, oh, there's a trap, don't do that. You're going to be silent. You're going to let them fall into the trap because you dislike them. You know what I mean? And it's the same thing that's going on with these. And so people are associating things incorrectly. You know what I mean? Just like people think about love. Love is literally commitment. Love is literally, I chose you, I'm going to be with you. That's what that's my word. That's my bond. That's what love is. Love isn't affection, kissing, hugging, Valentine's, all this kind of shit. That's more related to lust. That's affection. Those things are different. Yes, they come into a relationship, but those people don't understand this. This is another thing I want to talk about. When I talk about affection, lust, and love, and all these kind of things, when you think about Valentine's Day and all these kind of things, when you think about the person you love and stuff like this, I'll give you an example of, like I talk about sex. Sex for me is my connection with a woman. Sex for me is my emotional language. You know what I mean? So if I'm going to fall in love with a woman, the time I'm going to be closest to her, the time I'm going to be more emotional with her is when we're having sex, making love to one another. That's what sex is to me. You know what I mean? People look at it today as some type of activity that's just recreational. It's not. There's a connection that happens because we are driven. Our whole purpose is procreation. You see what I mean? And so, like, as a man, I'm driven to a woman through need and things like that. If she needs me, you know, she appreciates me. So you do all these kind of things. When we are in that state with a woman, there's a lot of things that are going on. Domination is another one. Just like when you talk about animals, dominating another one and stuff like that. I don't want to get into the juicy parts about it, but there's a certain type of domination that's going on. There's a satisfaction, a type of appreciation. There's a type of passion. There's a type of fulfillment that you get when you do that. When a woman surrenders to a man, just like when in the wild, when you have a male lion, a young lion submits to an older lion because he bested him. There's appreciation. You know, it's the same type of thing. Like I said, we are natural creatures. We have this advanced life, this advanced mindset, you know, that's blinding us from what we truly are. And so there's an appreciation that comes with that. There's a deep connection that happens when a woman is doing that, when she's in that vulnerable position and she's submitting unto you. You know what I mean? The subconscious picks up on these types of things and it starts to associate this woman with, it associates her, you know, literally like, oh, this is my woman, you know, this is my wife. You know, I cherish this woman. You know, I'll do anything for this woman. You know, I sacrifice for her. When we come together and do that, you know, that's a man's love language. That's how we build that connection with her. Women are not like that. They connect through communication. It's very different. You see what I'm saying? And so, like, women, they're more like that when a man is more affectionate towards them through communication, through hugging, touching, and doing all these kind of things and admitting a lot of his feelings to her and shit like that. Women are more driven by that. We are more driven by the physical connection. You like sex. That's why sex is always our goal. You know, anytime a man is dating you, sex is always his goal. You can try and say, oh, I'm not with you to have sex with you and all this shit. That's bullshit. That's all of our goal because that's our love language. That's the connection that we get. And so in society, women have kind of like pushed that away and treat that thing as if it's just some recreational activity or something that that everybody just looks at as just some pastime activity. And so where men are not getting what they need, you know. And it's also like once you experience that, it becomes more detrimental to your mental health. And so there are men who have never had sex before. That's the whole idea with being a virgin. You know, being ignorant to what sex is. You don't know the feeling. You don't know that connection yet because you haven't had it. You know what I mean? And so those men, those type of men, you know, they can they can exist a lot better than men who's experienced that. You know what I mean? Because once you experience that, you understand that your subconscious even understands that this is my purpose, this is what I need, you know, and so they become attached to it. And so, like in modern society, when you have like a lot of these men who are out of shape, you know, they may be seen as freaks or whatever. These women don't allow men to have that position with them. You see what I'm saying? And then it leads to a lot of problems. It leads to a lot of psychological issues, and this is where we see most of this pedophilia and all this kind of stuff coming into play, because women don't give them that chance or that position with them, and so they subconsciously begin to have all these scenarios, and it becomes literally like a mental disorder, and they start to look for people who they can manipulate, and they tend to be the youth. You see what I'm saying? And there's a lot more that plays into that too, because like also growing up, us not being taught about sexuality. Like when I growing up in the hood and stuff like that, you don't have parents teaching about that. You know about sex because your mom's being bust down by all these men, and so you start seeing all that kind of stuff, and so you start to associate, you know, that aspect of sex, but you don't really know what it is, and so you start enacting that. That's why like all little cousins and shit like that, you start playing house and trying to mimic what you see, and nobody's actually teaching you anything about that. And so especially in the hood, in black communities, we all start to experiment with each other and shit like that. And you know, it's a horrible thing, and people grow up with that trauma. You know what I mean? And when you start growing up in that, and then also once we start learning about porn and stuff like that, and then once we actually have that experience, that connection when we're that young, and then, you know, all of a sudden you might be like overweight, or, you know, you might have some type of problem, and then you can't experience that again, and it leads to psychological issues. And then, like I said, you start finding people who are more vulnerable, like children, and that's what ends up happening most of the time. And it turns into this thing, you know. And I never understood it until I started thinking about like what I'm going through now, since I haven't had that connection in so long, you know. And I'm just now starting to understand like how, because I've always understood the process of YNs, but I never applied it to relationships. I never applied it to being older, you know. So now when I started to look at some of them, I started making that connection, and I'm like, so this must be the same type of process that's going on in our relationships. When a woman pushes me away, you know, and don't give me sex, or says, you know, she's not attracted to me no more, or this and that, it destroys me as a man. My brain or my subconscious sees her as a point of pain. Stay away from her. You know, it pushes me away, you know, from her. It's the same thing like the process of YNs and stuff like that. You know, the subconscious is always working, taking in input. The brain does, I mean, the subconscious doesn't know that that's just some emotional problem. It still interprets it almost like it's physical pain. Stay away from that. You know what I mean? You don't put your hand in the fire because you know it's going to hurt. You know what I mean? And it's the same thing that's going on in our relationships. You see what I mean? And you know, that's the problem. You know, women think that withholding sex is going to make a man connect with her. You see what I mean? And that's not the case. It's just going to push him further away. And you have to understand too, just like I talked about it before, like if you give a dog, if you withhold food from a dog and only feed him when he's at his limit, you know, when he's about to lose his mind, eventually that dog begins to associate you with food. And he sees you, and he has this type of resentment towards you, but he knows that he has to respect you in order to get food. That's all you become to him. You become food, you know. And if you try to take his food away, when you give it to him, he's going to lash out at you. He's going to attack you. You see what I'm saying? Because he doesn't respect you anymore. And this is what a lot of these women are doing in society. They withhold sex, you know, when they're dating and stuff like that. You know, like, oh, if you're just looking for sex, don't even come talk to me and something like that. You know, when you have that type of mindset, it teaches men that that there's really no need to value you. You know what I mean? Because that's how we are connected. And so that's what I'm talking about. The older generations understood that. You see what I mean? Just like with the communication issue, the older women from the older generations understood that. That's why we have the memes on Facebook today. That's why we have the memes on TikTok. You know what I mean? When you had these, they show these older women in the past, they would show their breasts, pay attention, because they understood that those things hold our attention. We are attracted to women in their features. And that's why they did that, to hold our attention. Just like when a boy used to take a woman on a date and they would go see the movie that she wanted, which is some slow romantic drama movie, which is extremely boring to us. The boy would literally lose interest very quickly. Our attention span is only 10 minutes. And so imagine sitting there for like 2.5 hours, or even 2 hours watching a movie, a boring romantic movie. You know what I mean? You be antsy, trying to get out of there as fast as you could. You know what I mean? But women would do things to hold our attention. And that was the whole thing with the popcorn and the doing the sexual act with the popcorn in the movies. Because it's about holding the man's attention. And women understood that in the past. They would do things like that, and that's what drove these men to them. You know what I mean? You have to know how to nurture a man. You have to know what a man is, what our likes are, what our dislikes are. We're not like you. I don't think like you. I don't prioritize the same thing you do. I don't believe in manifestation. I'm a man. If something is too far below 50%, it's not even a probability for me, because I'm not going to take a chance on it. I have a family to lead. I can't make any mistakes. I have children and a wife on my back. If I make a mistake, they're going to feel the effects of that. And so I have to make sure that I'm always doing what I need to do the right way. You see what I'm saying? And so that's why, we're logical. You know what I mean? That's why a lot of men, serious, actual men, don't joke around, because we're about business and making sure that our families are getting what they need. You know what I mean? That's the sacrifice that we make for our families. The wife can be this joyful. In fact, that's what made women so joyful as wives. That's what made them hop around the house. You know what I mean? Jumping around the house, riding on clouds, rainbows, starships and rainbows. Women used to be exuberant, happy to be women, floating around the house like queens, doing whatever they want to do, just happy. While we went out here, busted up at the mines, working hard, doing all this kind of stuff, making a living for our wife and kids and stuff like that. That's a sacrifice we made because we cherish that woman so much. You know what I mean? But it's not like that today. Most of these women are miserable and stuff like that, and if you ain't treating them like kings, bowing down at their feet and doing all this kind of stuff, they don't even want to be with you. You know what I mean? And that's not the case. That's what made women happy, when they didn't have to do the things that they do today. Women are not made to be in survival mode. They shouldn't be wondering how the kid's going to eat. They shouldn't be wondering how the bills are going to be paid. They shouldn't be wondering all these kind of things about car insurance, making all these different payments. They shouldn't be worrying about any of that kind of stuff. It's not their role to. All they have to do is take care of the children and monitor the household. That was their job, and to raise the children. Women had it simple, and they loved doing that. When feminism came along, they turned these women into men. They made them under survival mode. That's why black women are so aggressive, always got an attitude problem, because they're stuck in the survival mode. You know what I mean? And it's not going to work. We don't like other men. Other men are like that. A lot of men are grumpy, having to go through all this kind of stuff. We don't have time for ourselves because we got to provide for our family. Men are like that. That's just the way we are. You know what I mean? But women are the same way. And so if you come into a relationship with a man doing what the man does, a man is not going to vibe with you. You see what I'm saying? When we get into a relationship with a woman, there's the physical aspect. A woman has to be beautiful to us. That's just how we are. You know what I mean? But beauty is not enough. A woman has to be submissive, which means respectful cooperation is what submission is. It ain't slavery. You know what I mean? And that's another thing. Women don't want to be submissive. They have this flawed ideology through feminism of what actually going on. You know what I mean? And it's like, that's what feminism does. It does the same thing like what the liberals do to us. They try to victimize racism and try to make us relive racism to keep us in this victim mentality in order to get our vote. That's the same thing what feminism did to women. It made women feel like they're victims, that men didn't respect them in society and this and that. That's not even the fucking case. For one, before the women's suffrage movement, there was no need for women to vote because they voted in the house with their husbands. You know what I mean? Women didn't need to work because they had a husband that went out and sacrificed for them to build the family, and his wage was enough. You know what I mean? So there was no need for that. That's the reason why they have positions, not because men didn't respect them in society. The women who started feminism was single, bitter women who men didn't want because they were unattractive. You see what I mean? And those same type of women are the ones you see. Big women. Huge glasses, bald heads, all these nose rings, and all. This is the same type of women. They hate men. Those were the people who started feminism in the past. Women only agree with those women because they're women. Women are naturally agreeable. That's what men are driven to. That's what makes a woman a good wife, by being agreeable. Agreeable is like almost like associated with submission. You know, agreeable. Like if I say we're gonna do something, you say, okay, honey. You know, you don't hear women doing that today. If you say we're gonna do something, no, she's gonna challenge you. She's gonna give alternatives. She's gonna do all these different kind of stuff instead of telling you, yes, okay, we can do that. You know what I mean? And that's the competition that we're going through. That's not compatible. You see what I'm saying? That's why men look for women who are submissive, respectful, cooperation. You see what I'm saying? That's why we look for that. We look for women who are vulnerable. A woman who's not vulnerable doesn't need a man. There's no reason for you to be in a relationship with a woman like that. You see what I'm saying? And that's why women who are not vulnerable don't have relationships. That's why most of these type of people who are in these positions of leadership as women don't have relationships, or they're in and out of relationships. You see what I'm saying? Because they don't need men. And so that's the type of things that drives men to women. And it's like you know, I started talking about you know, inspiration, and that's how a woman inspires a man, just pretty much by being herself, just being in her nature. You know what I mean? When a man sees a woman wanting these things, when she's treating him right and shit like that, you know, that's the thing. You know, like we see all these old movies where these women be standing on the porch when their husband get home, and he, you know, that's the kind of love that I want. That's the kind of woman that I wanted. And all it literally takes is for a woman to be in her nature to be that way. You see what I mean? When a man asks her to do something, yes, we can do that, honey. You know, reason with passion. Not come out aggressive and trying to compete all the time. You know what I mean? All a woman needs to do is be in her nature. And that would make a man crazy about her. That's what drove me crazy about young girls. They were so needy, you know, coming up. Like, I can be this for her. And that I love that because it made me feel like a man. You know what I mean? It made me admire and desire her. You know what I mean? Because she needed me. And she showed that. She expressed, you know, that she needed me and all this kind of stuff. You know? In modern society, a lot of women do give their man appreciation, but guess what happens? Straight after that, they're going into competition. You see, that cancels that out. And so that's another thing. You know, women, when they go through divorce counseling, I give you appreciation, I tell you this and that. You know, it doesn't matter if you give somebody appreciation, but then you compete with them. You know what I mean? That cancels that out. You know what I mean? It's like giving somebody a hug and then punching them in the face and expect them to, you know, give you another hug. I'm not going to give you a hug if you just punch me in the face. At that point, we're enemies. You know what I mean? And so that just canceled out the good act that you just did. You know what I mean? And it doesn't work like that. You got to be consistent. That's what marriage and relationships about, a consistency, loyalty, you know, all these different kind of things. It's about duty. There's a duty in a marriage. You know, you don't just come together with somebody and just expect that things are just going to fall in place. There's a duty, there's sacrifice, there's things that has to be done. You know what I mean? There's a duty in it, loyalty, or there's so much stuff. You know, but like I said, parents don't teach anything about this stuff. We think that relationships are just some thing we do once we get ourselves together. Relationships are about survival. You know what I mean? And people prioritize these careers and shit because that's what this modern society is doing. It's trying to give you all these alternatives to what we're supposed to be doing. It's not our purpose to go out and work and support an economic system. Our system is to our purpose is to our families. You know, family is more important than all the rest of this shit. You know what I mean? But people forgot that. It's all about consumerism. You know, getting the latest iPhones and getting cars that depreciate in value as soon as you step into them. You know, shit is pointless. You know what I mean? Cars is probably one of the worst things to ever buy. Like, you literally lose all your money. It's pointless. Things are garbage. You know, it's almost just like they say about credit. You know, you shouldn't have no car if you don't need it. You know what I mean? Because it's pointless. It's just a money trap. You know what I mean? It's just pointless. You spend all this money on clothes and shoes. Then what's the point of spending $300 on a pair of shoes? You're just going to put them up on a shelf. You know, or you're just going to go out and buy another $300 pair of shoes and then you're just going to throw that away. You know that's wasting money, right? I mean, most people don't even teach their kids this. I grew up with all these dudes who think they call themselves alpha males and they over here buying $600-700 shoes. And then next few months they're buying another $600 pair of shoes. You know what I mean? What kind of sense does that make? How can you lead a family if you're wasting money like that? You know what I mean? Buying all these expensive purses and bags. For what? You know, the smarter thing to do is be putting the money into the bank, CDs, investment funds, all these different kind of things that you could be doing to better yourself in the future and also save so your children can have a future. You don't even think about that. You know what I mean? That's what I would be doing with all that money. Then out here buying clothes, going to all these expensive places to eat and doing all that kind of stuff. And this just surprises me. You know, black people, we never even have been about that. All these luxury. You got black people going to these high-end restaurants paying almost thousands of dollars for a meal just for an experience. If you got the money, that's fine. But making it a priority for a date just to get to know somebody, like, hell no. You know what I mean? And that's what I'm talking about. And women keep talking about wanting respect. Women keep talking about men not objectifying them, but look at what they do. You're going to make a man go out and spend all this thousands of dollars on a meal just to have sex with you? What are you doing? You know what I mean? If we have to associate that we got to pay for everything, a man is not going to respect you. That's why after you have sex with him, he's gone. You know what I mean? That's not the way that works. Just like the scenario with the dog. If you keep making a dog work for food, you keep feeding him, when ever he's about ready to lose his mind, the dog's only going to associate you with food. He's not going to see you for anything else. You know what I mean? And he's always going to be aggressive towards you because he doesn't respect you. You know what I mean? And that's the way society is. That's why men are like that. They can't respect women. If you're going to make a man pay for everything, you're going to make a man work for it and do all this kind of stuff, that's the way people are going to see you. You know what I mean? Not every man thinks the way I do. You know, about value, the value of women and stuff like that. Nobody does that. You know what I mean? Most men don't even have sex like that. It's becoming, women don't even need sex these days. You know, they got all these toys. Like, it's not like that for us. We don't have nothing. You know? We can't fulfill ourselves. You know, they don't make any accurate alternatives for males. There is nothing. That's why we all waiting for these AI robots to come out. You know what I mean? That's why we waiting for that. So we could have that alternative, because there's nothing for us. Either you suffer, Well, honestly, the only thing you can do is suffer. There is no alternative. You can only suffer. You know what I mean? There is nothing accurate you can do. You know, all the photos and the videos, that's not enough. You know what I mean? That can fulfill you for seconds, but next 5 minutes later, you're going to be doing it again because there's no physical connection. There's no connection. You know, when a man and a woman come together and they act like that, there's emotions. There's energy that passes. You know what I mean? And that's what I talk about. You know, because like people don't understand that. Well, women don't understand that about that. When you are entangled with a woman like that, there's emotion, there's things that pass through. You know what I mean? There's a deep connection. You know? And the thing is, you know, people are being taught against that because the way that we use it. When you make somebody work for something, when you make something have no value like that, or when you overvalue things like that, you know what I mean? That's the kind of outcome you get. You know what I mean? That's why a lot of these men, they don't think a lot about women. They don't really think deeply about women. You know, they think that they look at them as like tools. Because yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, that's what we're doing. You know, you have to put all this work in and do all this kind of stuff. I don't know where people get this idea that that's something to be I mean, you have to read a situation. You can't just put every situation together and say, you know, this is what it is. You have to read every situation. Not everything plays out the same just because it has the same type of method to obtain it. You know what I mean? It's very different. It's not the same. You know what I mean? For most people, you know, most people like BMWs, you know, or fancy cars, but most people can't afford it. Some wealthy people can afford it, but it means nothing to them. You know what I mean? But people who can't afford it, it means something to them. You know what I mean? And there's also other people who can't afford it, but once they obtain it, they throw it away. Because that's the journey with the whole thing, right? And so, like, there's many different ways to look at things. You just can't look at things, you know, from one side. And that's what I talk about with reality. Because the way we look at reality, all of us run to extremes. It's either Christianity or atheism. I've done my research, and both of them have aspects of being true. And so, therefore, it can't be an extreme. You know what I mean? People look at the Bible and look at the things of the Bible as, oh, you know, everything's spiritual. No, it's not. Even in the Bible, the Old Testament tells you exactly who God is. You know, spiritualists have been telling you the whole time, God is literally the essence of life itself. That's why he has no beginning. You have to look at the reality as being the Most High. There is nothing else but the Most High. And so when he says there is no other God but me, he's literally saying there is no God. What is a God? A God is a made up term who people made up that term. God never called himself God. People call God God. You know what I mean? That's why he has no name. That's why he says, I am that I am. I am means time. It means now. It means present. It means existence. I am. There's no need to tell you anything beyond that. I am. Which means I'm the only thing that exists. I am that I am. That's a description of a being literally expressing to you that he is existence itself. You know what I mean? Anything that moves, talks, anything you touch, to smell, even the things you can't see, that's what he is. He is literally the makeup of existence itself, of the galaxy and all things in it. It is him. You are him. He is you. Everything is him. That's what he's saying. You can't live unless the Most High breathed a part of you into you. Like when it says the angels created men in their image. How? The angels have the ability to mold these clay, but where's the spirit coming from? The Most High. It says the spirit returns to the Most High who gave it. You can't be alive unless the Most High gave you a piece of himself. You see what I'm saying? That's what God is. And that's what a lot of spirituals have been saying for the longest time. That's what God is. That's what science shows you, that all things are connected. Even though I'm in this room, there are molecules in this room connecting to every other molecule and every other atom. Everything is connected. Everything is one. That's what it's saying. That's just common sense. People think it's so hard to comprehend what God is. It's very simple. You know what I mean? The problem is your human intellect. You think too smart for yourself that you become stupid. You know what I mean? That's what modern society is. You know what I mean? That's why the ancient civilizations understood things a lot better than we do. That's why all the old post office and all the old buildings today, we can't even replicate them with computer technology. Even AI can't replicate it. That's how smarter they were than us. And we like to look back at history and say these people were dumb, who drew on cave walls and stuff like that. The language on the cave wall was Paleo-Hebrew, a pictographic language expressing things through experience that everybody understood because they all had the same experience. That's ingenious. What are you talking about? That's how people communicated, through experiences. We all have the same experiences. We don't have to have different names for words and all this kind of stuff because we all experience the same thing. The picture is most important. It doesn't matter. That door is going to always be a door no matter what language somebody speaks. Everybody understands that that's a door. We understand the image. That's ingenious. What are you talking about? Calling these people primitive. We are primitive today. You know what I mean? It's just crazy. One way off topic, but I started off talking about what was I talking about? Yeah, I was talking about how a woman inspires. There's a lot more that goes into it, but I always have too much to talk about. But thanks for listening. Peace.